Hello, and welcome to another video. Today I'm partnering with Daler-Rowney to talk about their System 3 acrylics. And during this process, I'm going to be working on the front of this Vision watercolor pad by Strathmore. So this actually has this blue-gray mixed media cover that you can paint or draw on. So in order to do this, I'm using an X-Acto blade to lightly cut off the very first part of it. And then I'm going to take some glue and I'm going to place it underneath this little flap and just seal it down, and that will keep everything nice and sealed. Once the cover is prepared, I tape the border down and then I go in with the acrylic paints. So these System 3 acrylic paints are super vivid and have really high quality pigments, and they have a really great covering power. As you can see, I'm getting this really dark color with just one coat. These are also designed for indoor and outdoor use, so if you wanted to use them on more of an outdoor project, you could definitely do that. Say you're using them to paint some decorations for your lawn or something like that, you could definitely do that and it would be okay. And they are also super quick drying. You can see the top right corner is already starting to dry. These are also super light fast. They're not going to fade over time. So they're a really high quality artist's quality pigmented acrylic that you can work with that has a really nice fast drying time, and it dries to a satin matte finish, I would say, a little bit more matte than satin. And it does have a 54 color palette. So there are 54 different colors that you can get. So you've got all of the colors in the world that you could possibly want. These paints are about a medium viscosity. They're not super thin, but they're not really thick or heavy body either. So they're going to be nice for layering down nice thin layers, but you can get a little bit of impasto as well if you'd like that. Impasto, in case you don't know, is the little texture of brush strokes on the paper. When it like kind of sticks up and it's 3D and all yummy like that, that's what impasto is. And for this painting, I started with a sketch on the mixed media paper of a deer surrounded by flowers with a moon behind it, keeping it pretty classic and simple. I just thought I would do something pretty for the cover of this since it's a sketchbook and I wanted it to look cute. So I started with this really dark color that I mixed up using the darkest blue and then also a little bit of black. And then I started adding in some lighter tones down at the bottom and fading up, blending up into the darker color. So I started with that dark color and then added in those light colors over the top to kind of imitate clouds and kind of some haze and things like that. And because these are super pigmented, you can layer light colors on top of dark colors, no problem. It's not like in watercolor where you have to start with the lightest color. In acrylic, you could start with the lightest, the darkest, the medium color, whichever you want. I'm kind of a fan of starting with medium to dark tones and then adding in highlights and a couple more dark tones. I think the like mid-tones are a good place to start, but sometimes I will start with a darker tone, especially in a night sky or something like that. I'm blending this out using short, soft little brush strokes and just mixing the colors, adding in a little bit of white as I go, and just kind of adding in the color little by little so I can create that nice gradient that we're looking for. And then I start putting in the flats of the moon using not necessarily the brightest white, but a kind of light lavender color. And then I go around that with a dry brush with just a little bit of water on it to soften and blend it out so that it looks like a little hazy glow around the moon. Then I go in with a lighter color and I emphasize the edge of the moon, and then I go in with that pure white finally and start painting in the actual center of the moon. And this is how I make it look nice and glowy, and this is kind of where I'm going to start with that base layer. And with acrylics, I'm going to be working from the background up to the foreground, so that's why I'm starting with the sky, then moving to the moon, then I'll move to the deer, and then finally the flowers and things in front, so that you're not having to paint around things. You can kind of layer on top of things. So for in this case, I can paint over the antlers in certain places so that I can get a nice smooth blend without worrying about it, because I know that I can paint those antlers back in afterwards. As you can see, this paint is super opaque, but like I said, it's not thick or chunky, so you can get kind of a nice flat layer. And then I started adding in some little bits of lavender to emphasize the shading of the moon and add in a little bit of texture. And I'm keeping this pretty light and simple. I don't want things to be too textured, but I do want to suggest a little bit of texture in that moon so it's not just a big white circle. I also want to add in some stars, so I splatter on some white, and then once it's dry, I can go in with the deer. I'm going to paint the deer blue because I want to keep a similar color scheme across all of the paintings that I'm doing with the System 3 line so that you can see how consistent the colors are across the entire line. And so I decided to make my deer blue because in my world, deer can be blue, and I think it's fun, and paint animals whatever color you want because it's fun. And then I also go ahead and just add a light wash of blue over where the plants are going to be, just so that everything kind of has a similar tone. I'm not going to worry too much about getting in detail yet. I'm really just blocking things in right now. So I take a dark blue and start figuring out where the antlers are and kind of recreating those and building them back up on top of where the moon cuts into them, and just making sure that all of the blue gray of that mixed media page is covered so that I can get a better idea of how all of my colors are going to work together without the color of the page throwing things off, because colors look different depending on what color they're next to. So if they're next to a gray, they may look more like different than the way that it's going to look next to the dark blue of the paper or of the paint or something like that. This is one of the reasons that I encourage people to work around the whole piece, so filling in all of your colors and then adding in little bits of detail instead of doing one thing, finishing it, and then moving to the next thing. In this case, I'm working in like 3 different layers, so I'll work for the background, finish the whole background, work to the midground, finish the whole midground, and then do to the foreground and finish the whole foreground. And that's kind of how I'll work around the picture, but I do like to get those base colors in so that I can judge what all of the colors are going to look like. Now I'm kind of starting to add in some shading and also the markings of the deer. So I'm using white to establish where some of the bright markings are, and then a darker blue to establish where some of the darker shading is. But I'm not worrying too much about details in terms of like fur or things like that. I'm just establishing the basic patterning of the deer, the nose, the eye, that kind of stuff. And once that's established, that's when I can start going in and tweaking the edge of the deer, making sure that the face looks kind of the right width and the right shape. And then I can finally go back in and start adding some more shading details. And for that, I'm going to use a really small little brush, and I'm just going to keep mixing in different tones of blue and using a little feathered kind of stroke to imitate the idea of fur. And as you can see, I start with larger strokes, larger flat areas of color, and then I start building into the detail and cutting things away and pushing things back in. It's kind of a process, and I recommend working in layers, and don't be afraid when your painting goes through what I like to call an ugly teenage phase. I've talked about this on my channel a lot before, but basically, your painting starts out as this beautiful, amazing idea that you love, and you hold it like a baby, and it's sweet and it's beautiful. And then it kind of goes and starts like having tantrums and acting out, and then it hits puberty and everything's like gangly and awkward and weird, and then it blossoms into a beautiful finished painting or beautiful adult. So just kind of stick through your ugly teenage phase and work through it, and remember that you got this. There's a lot of trust involved in painting. You have to trust yourself that you know what you're doing and that you'll be able to figure it out. So whenever you're feeling stressed or like, I can't do this, just take a moment, take a nice deep breath and be like, no, I trust myself that I can do this. I am capable of this. Like, I can do it. It will make a big difference. I'm adding in the dark of the eye so it doesn't look quite so scary, and then still going in with all of those little tiny blue strokes to add in little bits of detail. I also want to get where the moonlight would be kind of reflecting on the edges of the antlers, so I'm using a very light blue to add that in, and then using a really dark blue to add in some more shading to the antlers. But mostly we're keeping the shading pretty light, but adding in a really, really bright highlight. So the contrast is more in the highlight area than it is in the darks area. One thing I haven't talked about much yet is the brushes that I'm using. All the brushes that I'm using are going to be by Princeton Select, and I really enjoy the Princeton Select brushes, especially for beginners, because they work for most different mediums. I use them for gouache, watercolor, acrylic, you name it, I use them for it. They're very sturdy. I'm not very nice to my brushes or kind to my brushes, but these seem to hold up very well to my treatment, so I appreciate that. Thank you, Princeton brushes. But that's what I'm using for the brush, and I do have a variety variety of different sizes of these brushes, ranging from like the teeny tiny ones to much larger ones. I recommend looking for a variety of sizes. Definitely get yourself a really small little detail brush, but you also want some large flat brushes for laying in larger areas. At this point, I'm just adding in the final little details to this midground area of the deer, and making sure that everything is blended out, that I have all of those final little highlights in the fur and all of the little markings, focusing on the inside of the ears and adding fur to there. Just those final little details that are going to make everything pop. And once I'm done with that, then I can actually move on to the foreground. So for the foreground, I have roses and succulents that I want to incorporate. I want blue roses and then green succulents. So I just start with adding in some basic shadows to the roses using a darker blue teal color and just loose brush strokes. With roses, I tend to use a lot of semicircles, just loose semicircles, and then I'll go in and add in the mid-tone right on top of that, really bringing that back and creating some harsher, harder lines around those shadows that is going to create more contrast. And I use a mid-tone for this so that I can then go back in and add even more highlights. I'm going to go in and blend out certain parts of those little flower petals. I'm going to leave a hard line on the inside, but I'm going to blend out the outside part of the semicircle. And then I'm going to go in and add in some highlights right where the light of the moon is catching on at the edges of the flowers. That's basically how I create roses. These aren't like necessarily 100% realistic, but you understand what they're supposed to be, and that's what I'm looking for in my art, is the impression of something. And I think it came out cute. So I like the deer surrounded by roses. Deer are my favorite animal, so I'm always happy to paint deer. Once I had my roses done, I started working in on the succulents, and I worked from the back of the succulent into the front of the succulent. So I started with a really dark green, establishing the very back leaves, and then I lightened my green a little bit, established the leaves kind of in the middle, and then lightened it even more, establishing the middle leaves and the very inner leaves. By doing this, I can really control the brightness and create that depth that I'm looking for with that layered look of the little leaves all popping up. So that's kind of how I create my succulents. I just start with that base layer of those different tones, and then I can go in and add shading to the leaves afterwards by using some highlights and some shadows. That will add variance and a little bit more contrast and make it seem less flat and like it's kind of popping up at you. For my greens, I like to use some yellows and some blues in them as well as white. It just kind of adds a little bit more of a realistic touch. But for this painting, I did use a little bit more white than normal because I wanted to add a slightly pastel vibe to the center of the succulents, just kind of keeping it very cool toned instead of adding in more of that warm yellow because of the moonlight that they're supposed to be under. And these are not necessarily like under the moonlight, they're kind of more a border, but I still want a kind of sense that they are in the same scene and that they have similar like colors and characteristics. So then I felt like maybe I'd gone a little too far though, so I did add a little wash of yellow on top and added that into the blue of the flowers as well, just to tint some of them teal. And with that, I was done, and it was time to take off my tape. And this is what I made with the Daler-Rowney System 3 acrylics. I'm really happy with how it turned out, and I think it's really cute that it's on the front of a little sketchbook. Also, my tape totally sucked. As you can see, I really struggled tearing it off and actually ripped some of my painting. This tape was just such a struggle, and I'm so glad that I'm finally done with this roll of tape. But you can see me fixing the painting using a little bit of light purple, and it worked out okay. You can't really tell that it's there at the end, and it's fine. Nothing has to be perfect, and mistakes happen. But that is what I created with the Daler-Rowney System 3 acrylics. I really like these acrylics. I think they're really easy to work with, and they dry really nice and fast, which is great for somebody that is impatient like me. So 10 out of 10, super excited to use these. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that it helped teach you some techniques and tips about how to use acrylic, because I do think that if you don't learn acrylic in high school, it can be a little intimidating. Thank you again for watching, and have a great rest of your day. Bye guys.